to start recording this session now. So all of this information is going to be made available for anyone who wants to sort of retrospectively refer back to this. Especially, I know there's been lots of interest in Matt Colquhoun's guest lecture a couple of weeks ago, which was fantastic. We're going to be making all of that available in new resources in our website. So we'll release details of that to you guys in sort of the coming weeks. Okay, so to make a start here, as Niall said, this week we're going to be focusing on music criticism, music writing from Fischer, and the idea of hauntology, which is something that we got into some really interesting discussions about last week with Arzu's presentation on the weird and eerie. So before we kind of jump into that a bit further, what I want to do is kind of foreground this week's discussion with an example of some of Fischer's music writing and some of his reviews by looking at one of my favourite artists, Lilley-Byrne. So you may or may not be familiar with Fischer's music writing. Some of you may even have perhaps read this particular review, which I'm going to be talking briefly about. So in 2013, Lilley-Byrne released his penultimate album, The Next Day, and Mark wrote a somewhat scathing review of it for Wire magazine. What's interesting about this, I think, is a few things. One is, first of all, Fischer really is echoing sort of a shared sentiment with many music critics, and suggesting that Bowie, as a real legend and icon, really set a template for what a pop star should be. So to quote Fischer, this template is a conceptualist, a designer, a sexuality and gender indeterminate, alien and or android, all outside and no inside, the changing face of strange, end quote. So if you are familiar with Bowie, which I hope all of you are, you'll probably also be familiar with the very iconic visuals that accompany his music. So from fashion, art and performance, he was really integral to what made Bowie who he was, and his many personas both on and off the stage. So Mark writes about this in this particular review, sort of, somewhat mournfully about the power of his 70s, late 60s into 70s personas. So I mean, we've got scruffy sort of late 60s mod Bowie into the hippie dandy, Ziggy Stardust, Major Tom, and the Thin White Duke, and then the Berlin years, which produced the fantastic album Heroes. So it's this serial passage through persona that Fischer writes about, the concepts and collaborators that he refers to. He's saying here that the artist is synthesizer and curator of forces and ideas, and I think that's really key here to the idea of sort of hauntology and some of the things that he picks up in his music criticism. So music, beyond the shock of this 70s new that Bowie represented, and beyond these dramatic personas, really lost its cultural power, and really it just wasn't as good. I like 80s Bowie and beyond, but it's not as powerful, it's not as innovative and sort of shocking as the sort of music that he was producing in the 70s. Now this is because, as Fischer suggests, the artist functions as a vessel for art. And as such, they are all exterior in a way, and they're feeding off the energies of the present to generate something new. Next slide, please. So it's not really surprising that Fischer was so sort of disappointed, but not unsurprised as well at the Next Day album that Lilley-Byrne released in 2013. So it was a very underwhelming album, and Fischer writes, these days Bowie stands for all the lost possibilities, going by the idea of art pop, which is to say not only pop plus art or pop as art, but a circuit where fashion, visual art and experimental culture connected up and renewed each other in unpredictable ways, end quote. So for Fischer, this album really was a bleak sign of the times. It was a sign of the absence of the cultural new and a longing for those lost possibilities represented by art pop. Even the album cover, which essentially stamps a white space, as you can see, onto the iconic 77 Berlin album Heroes, is a comment on this loss, this absence, and this sort of bleakness. Fischer writes, quote, "The image becomes more than a comment on Bowie. The man who once traded on his ability to escape the past is now trapped by it. It also functions as a diagnosis of a broader temporal malaise. What is this white space, this void? An optimistic reading would construe it as the openness of a present that is not yet decided. But a bleaker tale, one in keeping with the hackneyed quality of music, would see the white space as standing in for the vacancy of the present, with nothing there except a necessarily failed attempt to escape and recover the past. That's our pop predicament in 2013, end quote." So I sort of question here, is this still the case? And maybe this is something that we can pick up, I think, in the breakout sessions. Is the present still stale? Is it bereft of the new? I'm hoping no is the answer. Are recent iterations of art pop by artists such as Lady Gaga, you can see here her recent album Chromatica and her prior album Art Pop, pardon. Is it new? Is it innovative? Or is it merely recycling what's come before to sort of sell out these albums and stadium tours? I think Fischer really here was getting at, can we move forward through the past, and are we capable of that? Yeah, thank you. Next slide.
Right, so this kind of brings us into Fischer's work and the idea of the slow cancellation of the future, which is where we're going to start moving into an exploration of hauntology, and then some of his ideas that try and solve some of the tensions that Josie outlined. So Fischer's kind of criticism of kind of popular culture not progressing really kind of is foregrounded in capitalist realism. So it's present within that book that we kind of we've explored in previous sessions. And then he builds on that idea in his book Ghosts of My Life, which is where he kind of talks about the concept of hauntology in more detail. So in capitalist realism, Fischer writes that alternative and independent don't designate something outside of mainstream culture. Rather, they are styles, in fact, the dominant styles within the mainstream. So it's this suggestion that there can be no kind of counterculture anymore. There can be no kind of unique form. It's all kind of already incorporated into pop music. So in Ghosts of My Life, where kind of Fischer starts to deal with hauntology, it kind of leads with a similar observation, where he says it was through the mutations of popular music that many of those of us who grew up in the 1960s, 70s and 80s learned to measure the passage of cultural time. But faced with 21st century music, it is the very sense of future shock which has disappeared. Such an observation should suggest that the beginning of a time in which nostalgia becomes a permanent feature. It kind of suggests a time where there is no novelty to music anymore. And he kind of writes about the Arctic Monkeys, I Bet You Look Good on the Dance Floor, and Amy Winehouse's Valerie is kind of examples of this, where they have this old sound. They sound like they're written it for the period that they're singing about. So I think in the Arctic Monkeys song, there's the reference to 1984, and Fischer kind of says, well, this is like when you hear this song for the first time, and I actually feel I did the same. 1984 sounds like they're singing about the future and not singing about kind of the past. And this kind of takes us to this idea that we discuss on our next slide about the nostalgia mode, which I think Ben will outline in more detail.
Hi. Yeah, so thanks, Niall. So Fischer draws heavily in his characterization of the slow cancellation of the future in capitalist realism from the idea of the nostalgia mode developed by Frederick Jameson. One important thing to know is that for Jameson, this nostalgia is not accounted for in terms of a particular individual psychological nostalgia, a longing for a past historical era, but rather it's a attachment to the formal technique of or we might describe as older ways of making what seems futuristic appear, As his colleague Simon Reynolds argued, individual nostalgia in the modern sense is an impossible emotion, or at least an incurable one. The only remedy would involve time travel. And one of the criticisms that Fischer kind of has of contemporary pop music especially is the way that they attempt to perform it, in a way a time travel, but also as a kind of anachronism. They perform a quote-unquote classic sound, and this is very much in line with what Jameson defines the nostalgia mode is not the recollection of extinct cultural forms, but a formal attachment to them, a longing to experience them again. It reawakens the past associated with these objects, but more specifically, older ways of making the future appear. Then, as Fischer puts it, Jameson's nostalgia mode is better understood as in two ways. First, as the formal attachment to the techniques and formulas of the past, but also as a consequence of a retreat of a modernist challenge of innovating cultural forms to adequate to contemporary experience. A good example of this in one of an album that Fischer was quite fond of is Burial's song Gutted, which samples the 1999 movie in Ghost Dog Way of the Samurai, in which Forrest Whitaker monologues about how him and an unknown interlocutor are from a long ancient tribe, but they're now both almost extinct, seeming to evoke the blasted and historyless landscapes of neoliberal London and an immiserated rave culture, in which the future appears to have succumbed to retrospection.
Right. So this kind of idea of the nostalgia mode leads Fischer to kind of expand on the concept of hauntology in his book Ghosts of My Life. And hauntology is a concept that already was in existence in sort of the 1990s. It was coined by the philosopher Jacques Derrida. And Fischer kind of summarizes to kind of get to cut across Derrida's work, which is extensive and very hard to read. Fischer kind of summarizes his project as one whereby everything that exists is possible only on the basis of a whole series of absences which precede and surround it, allowing it to possess such consistency and intelligibility that it does. So this is a Derrida's logic of supplementarity, basically, whereby nothing has a kind of an inherent meaning unto itself. It only makes sense through the differences between its difference from other things and the absences that kind of creates. So that's kind of common to his I don't know, people may be familiar with Derrida, but that's common to his philosophy of like difference and trace. But what kind of Fischer says is hauntology can be more clearly demarcated from these things based on time. And so Fischer expands that this can be demonstrated through how hauntology is kind of a pun derived from ontology. So ontology is kind of the study of being, which is the study of a thing in terms of its self-identical presence. Whereas hauntology is ontology, where this thing that ontology would study cannot be fully present. So as with a spectre or a ghost. And then this is kind of expanded on in Ghosts of My Life by Fischer through Martin Hagland's work, where he explains that hauntology is being in relation to what is no longer and not yet. And to kind of expand on those concepts, so what the no longer means and what the not yet means. So no longer refers to something that in actuality no longer is, but remains effective as a virtuality. So there's a kind of examples of this. So if you think of things like trauma, whereby the initial kind of site of trauma is repeated, but is no longer present in the psychology of kind of a patient. Addiction is similar as well. So the return to the state of initial pleasure is never kind of there. You can't return to that initial pleasure, but you enter this kind of repetition in trying to recreate that state of initial pleasure. And then you could also point to something as maybe more arbitrary as something like memories in dreams and how they kind of feel real in the fact that then they're not actual anymore. but they kind of remain virtually effective. A political example is how history kind of constructs our lived reality if it is no longer present within our material reality. And so kind of maybe a controversial example of this, I was trying to kind of link it to current events, but almost the history of kind of colonialism, how that affects our present political reality. Colonialism is still present in today's world, but it's not present as it was in the 17th century, for instance. But it still affects us as if it was present today, through its being in the 17th century. To compare the no longer then to the not yet is that which has not yet happened, but which is already effective in the virtual. And Fischer is kind of more interested in this side of what hauntology is, but doesn't expand on it as much. So he outlines that for Marx and Engels, this is kind of what communism was to capitalism. It was the spectre that haunted capitalism. It has this virtual draw whereby they believed communism would kind of manifest itself through capitalism. It would be more desirable. It would pull kind of society in that direction. And then a contemporary analog to this could also kind of be decolonization, in that it hasn't yet been achieved, but it has this effective draw, this desire to be achieved, and it is having kind of an effect on the present as well. So Derrida's concept of hauntology was also designed in relation to the idea that there is no longer resistance to capitalism. So his book Spectres and Marks, where he coins the concept, was actually a response to Fukuyama's The End of History and The Last Man. And then Fischer kind of extrapolates from this that he's also exploring a crisis of space as well as time, which he ties to the rise of cyberspace, to kind of digital cultures, or what he calls a global tele-techno-discursivity, which is kind of a very wordy way of just saying, yeah, cyberspace, the internet, this collapsing of space and time, which is why so many people from so many different places can be here in this one call today, I think. So this brings us to kind of hauntology and music. So hauntology has a further specific meaning to Fischer, in that it describes music, which technology examined as it describes music where technology examines kind of materialized memory, or where digital music kind of melancholically explores the physicality of analog media. So this type of music often relies on an artificial crackle that replicates vinyl or tape recordings. And that example that Ben gave of that burial record earlier would be an example of kind of hauntological music. And it is interested in this sense of what old music would sound like, within the context of its old kind of media. So not necessarily what it would sound like if it was embracing its digital media, but what it would sound like on a vinyl. But then that vinyl is that sound is completely artificial. It's replicated on kind of the digital recording. And so for Fischer, this implies that digital music relies on the reproduction of the limits of these hardware media. It cannot produce the future because it cannot locate and confront its own limits. Analog limits are no longer, or kind of digital limits, the limits to digital media in music are kind of not yet. So Fischer explains that in hauntological music, there is an implicit acknowledgement that the hopes created by post-war electronica or by the euphoric dance music of the 1990s have evaporated. Not only has the future not arrived, it no longer seems possible, yet at the same time, the music constitutes a refusal to give up on a desire for the future. So the melancholy produced by these hauntological musics, for Fischer, has a political dimension to it, which is akin to kind of Derrida's writing on hauntology, in that they refuse to accommodate to a sort of a capitalist realism. They suggest that the limits of analog media confront us with a vanished tendency a virtual trajectory to kind of its progression, to its surpassing. And this trajectory is what Fischer's interested in Ghosts of My Life, really. He's interested in kind of like, how do we recover this trajectory? And he labels this trajectory a popular modernism. And what does he kind of locate this in? So this probably takes us back to the first week of our workshop. So Fischer locates kind of a popular modernism in the culture that surrounded these kind of musical artifacts when they were kind of new, when they had an element of newness to them. So he locates it in the music press and more challenging parts of public service broadcasting, as well as the post-punk brutalist architecture, Penguin paperbacks, and the BBC radiophonic workshop. And he explains that in popular modernism, the elitist project of modernism was retrospectively vindicated. At the same time, popular culture definitively established that it did not have to be populist. Particular modernist techniques were not only disseminated, but collectively reworked and extended, just as the modernist task of producing forms which were adequate to the present moment was taken up and renewed. So to kind of end this kind of this PowerPoint, what this means for Fischer is best summarized in this end quote. Why he's interested in hauntology and kind of what a popular modernism offers is that what should haunt us is not the no longer of actually existing kind of social democracy, but the not yet of the futures that popular modernism trained us to expect, but which never materialized. These spectres, the spectres of lost futures, reproach the formal nostalgia of the capitalist realist world. And so these lost futures then are kind of this, for Fischer, this idea that the establishment that surrounded kind of music was invested in this idea of a populist kind of progress. But one that was also kind of very much embroiled in this idea of engineering and trying to make a new kind of commodity, which kind of capitalism no longer delivers. It no longer has this sense of new commodity. And that's why Fischer locates it within, so that list earlier on, all these things were invested in trying to make something new, so that they could kind of, well, mostly to kind of sell things, but so that they kind of were always in tune with a popular force. And I think that what Fischer sees is that that's kind of gone, and that the fact that that's gone doesn't mean that you have to give up on the notion that it was kind of an idea that had some sort of function in engineering culture, in bringing people together through novelty, in a sense. And that kind of concludes our presentation today. So there's kind of a series of questions that we have for our talks, but I think what we'll do now is we'll pass over to Milad to tell us about his project, and then we'll hand over to Natalie for any further comments and kind of to talk more about that hauntological orchestra.
Thank you, Niall. Right, so I'm just gonna quickly share my screen here. There we go. So hopefully you should be able to see my desktop there with the presentation loaded. Right. So before I kind of go ahead, I think I might need to make a quick side note here, is that what I'm going to be presenting to you today is more from the perspective of, the practical perspective of composition and music writing, rather than a musicological one, which would be, I guess, more concerned with the ideas of sort of any cultural or sociological association, or the idea of hauntology, for instance. So with that said, I guess I'm just going to go on with it. So as I briefly pointed out in the introduction, my research focuses on the sonification of data which is derived from the biomolecular research of cancer cells. And the main tool that I use in doing this transformation, in creating sounds purely or directly from data, is known as data sonification. And for those of you who might not be aware of it, it's defined as a subtype of auditory displays in the handbook of sonification, or sonification handbook. And auditory displays are essentially any displays that use non-speech audio to represent information. So sonification is a tool that in fact serves the creation of auditory displays. And essentially it's the transformation of data relations into perceived relations in an acoustic signal for the purposes of communication and interpretation. So very much like how a map is preserving aspects of distance and size and etc. in a geographical, of a geographical area, sonification does so from the data domain and the sonic domain. And we're already very accustomed to it, you know, thanks to our various gadgets and phones and computers. You know, we deal with data sonification on a daily basis without even realizing. And of course, the use that I'm interested in is its function within arts and entertainment and music per se here, which is more of a generative tool to create sound material for composers and artists to work with. A bunch of pictures as well. So data sonification has been around in music, has been used in music for a while now. You can trace back examples to mid-50s. And I've used the phrase data-driven music here because that refers to music that uses data sonification as a generative tool. And there's a distinction there, because when you use data sonification as a scientific tool, then there are other factors that come into play. There, you know, the scientific and academic rigor and reproducibility, comprehensibility of perceptible changes in the acoustic signal that represent the data domain are prioritized, but not so in music. But anyway, so Yanis Xenakis, the Greek architect, composer, and mathematician, famously used statistical and stochastic processes and mapped them to pitch and rhythm and metastasis, which he composed in 1965. And before that, Pythopracta used the Brownian motion of gas particles and mapped them to the glissandi section of a string orchestra. And there are other examples as well listed here. In life music, John Dunn and Marianne Clark, a biologist and a composer, collaborated, and they sonified DNA sequences to create this audio CD album called Life Music. And Frank Halbig, for instance, used data from melting ice cores of the polar ice caps to sonify and to represent the climatic change of our planet. So as you can see, there are various sort of scientific concepts and fields being investigated by artists, and data is being used to generate sound material, to create art that has some sort of, that bears some sort of reference to its scientific domain. Carla Scaletti and Birmingham Ensemble for Electroacoustic Research, which, you know, is part of our own music department here, they both use data that comes from particle collision data that comes from experiments conducted at CERN Institute, and they write music with it. So moving on to how I do things and what I do in my project, in addition to taking data from the biomolecular data, protein measurements of cancer cells, and sonifying them and making music with them, I also draw upon an extra musical concept, which is relevant to what I do, relevant to my data as well. And that concept is the hallmarks of cancer, which is the title of a seminal and very well-recognized piece of literature, the most well-recognized, I guess, piece of literature in the field, which essentially conceptualizes cancer as a disease. So it gives it 6 main characteristics and traits to cells that altogether they have to be present in order for a cell to become cancerous or proceed from a normal state to a cancerous state. And what I'm doing is using this as inspiration, as an extra musical concept that guides the narrative of my works and aspects of form and some of the syntactic choices that I make in terms of sound organization and developing gestures of various textures that or sounds that I've generated with from the data. So to put it, I guess, in a nutshell, I'm kind of telling the story of these hallmarks in my pieces, in my composed pieces, in which I do exercise my my role as a composer in manipulating the sounds that I generate, and you know, I do sort of insert control to a certain extent in the composed pieces that I write, which is of course not the only work that I'm doing. I'll be showing you an example of a more sort of sound installation or direct sonification of the data today as well. So just to give you a peek at the type of data that I work with, I'm not going to get into it because it's going to take a while to explain this Excel sheet that you see here, but this is typically the kind of data that I work with, and I work with in collaboration with Bart's Cancer Institute in London, part of Queen Mary University, and they supply me with this data and relevant insight to what it means, what do these numbers mean, and how can some sort of scientific interpretation be made from this Excel sheet. And you can only see like 52 rows here, but typically there are around 8,000 to 9,000 measurements of separate proteins during the course of each experiment that this data is pointing to. These are some of the devices that are responsible for generating this data. On the right, you see a mass spectrometer. And on the left, you see a fluorescent dye cell imaging system that they use fluorescent dye to count cells and generate analysis data. So moving on, the way that my composition process essentially works is it's mainly the sonification process is all implemented in Max MSP programming environment, so it's all done through computer programming. And I basically myself divide my composition process into three main levels. At the very first and bottom level, I handle the data that I just showed you. I parse it, categorize it, traverse it in a time-based manner, and that is because musical events also have the temporal quality and they happen sequentially in time. And I as well try to get some interpretation from the data to make meaningful sort of assumption, well, not assumptions, to make meaningful interpretations, mathematical interpretations from the data values that I have, so that when I'm mapping that data to sound parameters, it's not arbitrary or random, and there's some element of retraceability left, that in case, you know, maybe if you're really curious to be able to trace one specific sound, you can do that back to its data values. And once I've done this, I map those data values according to the interpretations that I've made to sound parameters. Using various sound synthesis techniques, I generate various sonorities and textures, and then once I'm happy with the amount of textures and sounds that I've produced, I compose pieces with them using the narrative of the hallmarks of cancer. And this is sort of my process for composing the pieces. As I mentioned, it's different when I'm dealing with more sort of indeterminate in terms of my own influence as the artist, and determinate in terms of the data being sort of in power of the sounds, or you know, directly manipulating the sounds that are heard. When it comes to more installation, sound installation, audiovisual installation work that I'm also doing in my research. Yeah, well, I think I'm running on 9 minutes, so I do have one more slide that kind of touches upon some aesthetic choices that I've made. I can show that as well, or I can just hop to the examples. Well,
go ahead. Go ahead.
Right. Okay. Well, if I'm doing good on time, then I'll just show this. So as I mentioned, the sound organization syntax that I'm using is both abstract and abstracted at the same time. It's abstract in the sense that the hallmarks of cancer are guiding it, guiding some of the decisions, and it's abstracted because the sonified material and their interactions and their sonic potential are also guiding how they are organized. So it's pointing towards an acousmatic mode of listening and composition. For those of you who are wondering what acousmatic mode of listening or composition is, it's sort of the opposite of how we generally, like how we composers generally treat writing music, that is instrumental music, and that's treating sound as a concrete object first and foremost, and then manipulating it, molding it, and turning it into an abstract composition, which, as I said, is the opposite of how instrumental music is composed, which starts with an abstract idea in the mind of the composer, and then through notation and scoring becomes a concrete performance. And I have chosen to adopt an acousmatic mode of composition. So in that regard, I have decided not to focus on preset pitch sets, scales, or any modes, or any specific harmonic and rhythmic structures that, like, you know, other works, unlike other works that have used sonification from this scientific domain, which is the human genome. The reason that I've done this is to sort of avoid the trap of the listener making any immediate source bonding or making any immediate cultural connection to any specific genre of music. For instance, if I map the sample of a techno piece of music, I guess, to some of my data and start modulating it, then as soon as someone picks up on the fact that it's a piece of techno music, they're going to think that it has some relevance to dance music or techno culture, which for my purposes, you know, I want to avoid that. I also sometimes call it a noise-based approach because a lot of the sounds that you will hear in my examples do resemble electronic noise. So with that, I would like to now head over to Reaper and give you some examples. I'm going to be playing two short excerpts of one of a very old piece that I wrote, like one of the first pieces that I wrote using the data, and then an excerpt of the most recent one that I wrote for this year's festival, Beast Festival, the annual festival that we have. Okay. We had some difficulties in sound setup earlier, so hopefully you'll be hearing this with relatively good quality. Right. That was a short excerpt of a more sort of purist approach towards data sonification. So a lot of that was purely the data. Of course, there was, as you can tell, some amount of organization and composers' manipulation there as well. But the next one that I will play for you, the next excerpt, oops, sorry about that, shows more of the composer's control, my control over sound manipulation. Right. Hopefully you were able to listen to that in relatively good quality, because a lot of, you know, thanks, a lot of these pieces that are, you know, textual and spectral in the sense that the focus is more on, you know, the orchestration of frequencies. Thanks, someone clapped for me there. They do unfortunately rely on the proper sound system to get the point across. And the last example that I want to show you is a more direct sonification as part of an interactive audiovisual installation that I'm working on to put up next year. Hopefully things will have gone to a relatively normal state so that we can actually hold the festival, our annual festival. And this is kind of an interpolation of the data that I showed you in a virtual 3D space, and it sort of is designed by, designed based on the principles of model-based sonification, which is one of the approaches towards data sonification. And to just briefly describe it to you, a model, a physical model of any sort is kind of created that works as an instrument, and then the data that is being sonified manipulates that model, or manipulates the same space that that model is functioning in, and then sound is created based on these two interactions. So it's, as I said, it's essentially like an instrument that is data dependent, and the player or the audience or whoever is working with it can essentially have fun or play around with it. And the way that I've created this here is that I've interpolated the data into this physical virtual space, and then I've used a mass spring 3D model, and I'm manipulating that model based on the data. But my influence as the composer in terms of manipulating the sound that is produced and what you hear is minimized here. So I'm just gonna stop talking and show you how it works. Here we go. So those bright dots that you hear, that you see, those are the data points, and the model itself, I'm just gonna bring it down for you to see. So each point is responsible for creating one channel of sound, which is dependent on the data values. And as I'm playing around with this model, I'm essentially causing sound to be heard. But that sound and how it sounds and what sort of pitch it has and how long it is and how loud it is, it's all sort of dependent on the data that I'm working with. So it's kind of like I'm performing together with my data, you know, in collaboration, I guess. And one thing that I'm gonna, sorry about that, one thing that I'm gonna do here is just quickly change the sound that you will hear. And I'm gonna drop in a bunch of other samples, some gamelan recordings that I made earlier. So I'm gonna entirely change the sound of it, but it'll still be data dependent. So it's kind of the aesthetic of the data, but you know, using different sounds, whatever sounds I choose to input. I'm just going to run it again. I'm not sure if you're able to hear. It's very low. Right. Well, it's not sounding as interesting as I thought it would. But anyway. And with that, I would like to, I guess, conclude this presentation, some of the sources that I used for this, and thank you for your time. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you very much for that, Milad. It's very, very interesting, actually, coming off the back of kind of that talk, with kind of this question of maybe modernism that's present in Fischer's work, and how, in a way, like this is almost exemplary of a modernism, a modernist approach to kind of music, right? I think if we go to Natalie, I'm sure she'll have a lot of interesting things to say about that, because I know that she's very interested in kind of experimental popular music. And I also am very fascinated to hear about the Hauntological Orchestra as well.
Thanks very much, Niall. I've got a couple of things I sort of haven't pre-prepared much, but I'll talk a bit, and then there's some little bits I can share depending on time. Otherwise, I could maybe send them on later on. I think there's a few things I'd like to say. It was fantastic. Thank you for inviting me and for all of that. And thanks, Milad. It was really nice to hear your work. I've been, I guess, some thoughts that have come up today and in thinking about this topic more generally. I'll sort of start by talking about the Hauntological Orchestra, but it's also, I guess, sparked some thoughts about local musicians I've worked with for many years, and hauntology in my own composition, and sort of this idea of being a creative musician with this concept. And there's an idea, I think, around the conversation between culture influencing theory and then theory influencing culture. So the Hauntological Orchestra, in a way, was a tongue-in-cheek response to the idea of hauntology. So I'll just read you a quote about how we were described. Just to give you some context, I'm a sort of classically trained musician and composer, but was musically raised on charity shop records, going to the Birmingham library and borrowing all sorts of analog, tangible materials. So it's very applicable to my own identity as a musician. But I sort of worked freelance, and as viola player, keyboard player, went to do a sort of stint with the Hauntological Orchestra in London. This is a ensemble put together with Resonance FM and Johnny Trunk, and it was a fundraiser for Resonance FM, and I believe the gig took place in 2013. It's great having to go back through archives to find this information. So yeah, in February 2013, and we performed, did one-off gig. I only really performed once or twice with them. This is a gig at the Grosvenor in London. So top of the bill is to be a live set by Resonance's very own Hauntological Orchestra, the UK's foremost explorers of the art of audio hauntology, sparkier than a Bry nylon spacesuit, cooler than Jacques Derrida's old fridge freezer, by turns painfully hip and mind-bogglingly kitsch. The orchestra exists at the point where the funky but fashionable faux pas gives way to a vintage electronic vibe to die for. And then they've gone on to describe quite well, but loose collection of singers, musicians, electronic noodlers, definitely, I remember that, plus the Franklin, and then it sort of goes on, so I can send this link, but it's sort of collective of musicians, and I guess something that united us was a love of music gone by and an interest in improvising around reshaping music. So we essentially, it's a glorified name for a cover band, really. We were reworking and playing songs by love. I was really happy I was figuring out all the string arrangement. For a musician, it was a great challenge to sort of think, how can I represent the whole of Alone Again, or string arrangement on one viola on stage in London? And then the singer who was singing actually had worked with Love back in the day and was sort of commenting on it. So it's this sort of referential, some people who were there at the time, some people who weren't, like me. We were playing and reworking songs by Love. We were doing soundtracks by David Shire, Peter Thomas Sound Orchestra, Brian Eno, and it's this process of trying to echo or homage or perform via the past. And for this fundraiser, I thought it was ironic, it's a fundraiser in terms of capitalism as well. So I mean, that's really just to give you a sort of sound taste. I always think it's nice to hear stuff, but I'm sure some of those names ring a bell. And it was almost segue. I remember that we didn't pause between songs or introduce it, so it was like an auditory tour of the past, and we would have people improvising with electronics alongside. So a lot of the themes you've been talking about in terms of modern technology, talking back to older music, makes a lot of sense in terms of the Hauntological Orchestra's outing. I'll move on slightly from them. I'm happy to talk more or try and find recordings of what we did. But yeah, just this idea of, I like how it's described, you know, I didn't at that time had done a master's, but I wasn't really aware of the concept of hauntology or sort of deliberately applying that, but it was applied to us and then we were referring back to it. So it's a nice conversational aspect. But I think I'll move on just to say a little bit about, I think some relevant stuff just for a few minutes, if that's okay, about, is that all right time-wise for you guys? Okay, just about Birmingham scene. So I noticed the label that got mentioned in terms of hauntology was the Ghost Box label, and there was a band who I think only put a little bit out on the Ghost Box label, but in terms of people who were, you know, deemed hauntological and the key label in relation to that, there was a local band called Broadcast who I recorded for a long time ago, band's called Pram. And there's a band that I'm quite good friends with. I'm actually in the music video that came up when I was thinking about this. Misty's Big Adventure, who are based in Birmingham, have been going for a good 20 years or more now. And they did a song called Fashion Parade, which was a response to bands such as Kaiser Chiefs and Franz Ferdinand, referencing post-punk music. And sort of complicating the idea of hauntology to be hauntologies, and I think approaches to hauntology, because it was a critique and really a piss take out of them. And the cry at the end of this video is to end the bland age. So I can just share you a sort of still from the end of this video, but I would recommend going and watching the whole thing. Okay, so I'll pause it there. So I realise I can't see any of you when I'm sharing, so if you're waving, stop, no more. So I'm sure anyone from sort of the eras will recognise there's a lot of visual references to music videos of Franz Ferdinand and Kaiser Chiefs, and taking it's do you wanna, do you wanna, so turning that into lots of money, lots and lots of money. And we were in that video, lots of me and my friends sort of providing the extras, but it really sort of pissed them off. But what was interesting, towards the end of the song, it goes on, there's a sort of brass call, like I say, of Julian Cope. So Gareth, my good friend, the composer for that, was himself doing what he's critiquing, but it's the sort of take on the hauntology that he's critiquing. It's the fact they're making money in this sort of pastiching that's got out of control. You know, we all have been, as I said, raised on these charity shop records, and it was a sort of prequel to the era I think Mark Fisher's talking about. So that was from 2006, a very near the Arctic Monkeys video. Yeah, so just some thoughts. I'd love to discuss this further with you all in the breakout rooms, but I'll keep moving on. So sort of idea of an intra-musical critique, hauntologies, and then the analog digital thing's very key, I'd say. There's a lot of relevance with local music makers and the sort of alternative, whether that really works as a term anymore, but seeing Broadcast, Pram and Misty's Big Adventure all hanging around Moseley in the early noughties. Lots of reference, lots of crackle, but also deliberate use of analog form. So recording onto tape, obviously I'm sure you're aware, but lots of bands choose that to capture a warmth, myself included. I've recorded songs onto tape, then put back into a digital medium. It's a seemingly arduous process that we go to try and capture something of a warmth of a time gone by, not to sound like songs from the past, but to sort of signal to them. So yeah, a piece that I composed for a venue that Niall knows, an artist organisation called Friction Arts, is a space they have in Digbeth called The Edge, when we're allowed to exist in these venues. And I wrote a piece there, which was an installation piece, and I'll just share a photo again of this space. And I was using digital technology, just say a few minutes on this, and then I'll let you move on. I was using digital technology to move beyond past possibilities, so just also to add a complication to this analog digital form, in that I was composing a piece and I was trying to echo back to the idea of the pianola, which was the player piano in Victorian era. So I composed a piano loop, as it were, and had a loop pedal hidden under the piano. So as a composer, I didn't want the digital technology to be visible. But I was using it in order to do what more than a player piano could do. So I was using a piano that could play multiple loops throughout a piece, using the loop pedal to do that, and but hiding that, disguising it. And the idea of absences, I think, is another thing that's very interesting in terms of, I think, what you were talking about as well, Milad, in that we were hidden, we weren't visible as performers, so we were removing ourselves from the space. So I'll share the photo of the setting, importance of spatial sort of consideration, I think, with all of this somehow. That's me at the piano, and the loop pedal is out of view underneath. And the audience sat inside this space, and I would loop something on the piano, click the loop to actually record my live piano playing, leave it running, and disappear out the side curtain. This is in 2015, about 5 years ago, and we did it as part of an artist exhibition. The audiences would come in, and as I would disappear through the curtain, there were other musicians behind the curtain, my husband and another friend, and we moved around the space surrounding the audience. So it's got me thinking about that, and it's interesting now, the conversation I can go away and have with myself about theoretically what was I trying to achieve, but creatively I knew I wanted to play with this space, analog, digital, and I also had a tape recorder at one point, so I thought, oh, I'm really ticking all the boxes there. So yeah, there's just some sort of thoughts, local responses, and just sort of anecdotes from my own career that I think might be something I will go away and think further about. So thanks for having me, and hope that was of interest and use.